This program is presented by University of California Television. Like what you learn? Visit our website or follow us on Facebook and Twitter to keep up with the latest UCTV programs.
Next on Up Next.
We do have to tell a story about where we are in relationship to the past. I don't think that's a silly thing to do. On the other hand, we have to be constantly saying to ourselves, what did people in the past think about what they were doing?
Welcome to Up Next. I'm Marty Lasden, and on this edition we consider the future of the past. My guest is Lynn Hunt. She's a distinguished professor of history at UCLA, a former president of the American Historical Association, and in addition to her groundbreaking scholarship on the French Revolution, she is widely known for her provocative essays on the nature of history and what it means to be a historian. Professor Hunt, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
You know, I imagine that to many of our viewers, the future of the past is going to sound an awful lot like a Michael J. Fox Back to the Future movie. But it is true, is it not, that while the past itself is fixed, the way that historians look at the past and write about the past is changing constantly. Isn't that right?
Absolutely. And it's actually not even totally true that the past is fixed, except in our kind of imagination of it. That is because people in the past actually had very conflicting views of what was happening. Even the facts of what was happening was a bit up in the air. But for us, over time, since the past happened, no matter how far away or how close it was, our view is always changing depending on who we are, where we are, and where we're looking from at it. We see different things.
So to preserve the pastness of the past, the integrity of the past, should historians resist the temptation to make history useful to those of us who live in the present? Or is it more important for historians to keep the past alive by continuing to make it as relevant and as useful as possible?
It has to be both, in my opinion. That is,
how can it be both?
It can absolutely be both. Let's take, for example, the history of ancient Rome, which was extremely important all the way up through the end of the 19th century. Every schoolboy, and they were mainly schoolboys going to special university, but even to regular schools, schoolboys learned the history of Rome. They had to memorize the speeches of the great orators. It was really present to them. Now, that's fallen out of favor in the 20th century. But so on the one side, I say it's really important to keep doing the history of ancient Rome, even though we don't think it has that kind of immediate political usefulness that political leaders up until the middle of the 20th century thought it still had. Because we don't know in the future what's going to be interesting to us. We need to keep everything that we know about the past alive into the present, even if it's not immediately relevant. So that's one side. On the other side, absolutely the relevance matters because it makes us see things we didn't see before, so we can add to that treasure chest of history that we've developed over time, and we have to keep adding to it, and we have to also keep maintaining it. So I think the two things are actually both really important. The tradition, if you will, and the relevance for the present.
Back in 1972, the then premier of China, Zhou Enlai, was asked what he thought the impact of the French Revolution was. And he said then it's too early to tell. Now, I know that you're one of the world's leading experts on the French Revolution, and I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that back in 1984, when you published your book called Politics, Culture, and Class in the French Revolution, that book itself set off something of a revolution in your field. But now, 40 years have elapsed since Zhou Enlai made that remark. Since that time, are we a lot closer to understanding the impact of the French Revolution, or do you think it's still too early to tell?
Well, I think there's always been very interesting views on the impact of the French Revolution. And in that sense, I would disagree with Zhou Enlai. I take his point, which is that as time goes on, we have different views and therefore more evidence with which to think about. And so in that sense, it's always too early to tell because we're always going to find out.
It's like a horizon.
Exactly.
We never get to the end.
Well, we hope we don't get to the end because that would be the end of human life.
Yeah.
But the fact is that as early as things started happening in 1789, Edmund Burke, for example, in Great Britain, is writing one of the most brilliant and sort of perceptive accounts of the Revolution. Way before some of the most interesting events had happened, he had already seen things that we still argue about today. So it's not a fixed thing in terms of when is the right moment to look back at things.
You know, I've read maybe 3 or 4 books on the French Revolution in the last few years, and what I see when I read about the French Revolution, I see a movement that in a rather brutal way overthrew what was essentially a reform-minded monarchy, which set the stage for a reign of terror that claimed the lives of tens of thousands of people, which in turn set the stage for Napoleon, who instigated a series of wars across Europe that claimed as many as 7 million lives. That's what I see. Do you see something very different than that?
I do see something different from that. I mean, it's not that I dispute that covers some of the main developments of what happened in the Revolution. I'm more interested in how the Revolution, myself, am more interested in how the Revolution just shatters the givenness of the previous regime, of the old regime, of a society in which monarchy is self-evident, in which aristocracy is self-evident, and in which the idea that hierarchy is natural is self-evident to everyone, including the people on the bottom. What I'm interested in the Revolution is that it shatters that vision of the world and therefore makes possible the idea of democracy, of equality, of freedom for everybody, of rights. All of the things that we associate with the modern forms of government have their origins, not just in 1789, but the shock is so profound of the French Revolution that it forces everyone to rethink the foundations of the moral, political, social, and cultural order in a way that is really breathtakingly thoroughgoing. And so that's what I'm interested in, is how could that happen in that way? And then why do things develop in the sort of sequence of events that they develop?
Do you think we do those who lived in the distant past a disservice when we make moral judgments about them?
I think it's a problem when we simply use our own standards to talk about the past. But that's related to a much bigger underlying issue, which is our tendency to view history as having an end to it, which is us. That is, yes, that we represent the sort of highest possible development of civilization, and then history is how everyone else lacked something that we have that they didn't have.
This is a Whig interpretation of history.
That we need. That is a tremendous problem, because on the one hand, we do have to tell a story about where we are in relationship to the past. I don't think that's a silly thing to do. On the other hand, we have to be constantly saying to ourselves, what did people in the past think about what they were doing? Not what do I think about what they were doing. What did they think about what they were doing? We have to do something with that, pay attention to it. The ethics has to be to listen to what they are saying. And then that doesn't mean we're not going to have a debate with them. It doesn't mean that we're going to say, oh, well, slavery is fine because people thought it was fine in the 18th century, and there wasn't that much objection to it until the end of the 18th century, so, why are we so bothered about it? I don't mean that at all. But we do have to try to find out, what were they thinking when they were doing that?
In this same vein, let me ask you about Thomas Jefferson.
Yes.
Because of all the freedom-loving slaveholders who founded this country, he's the guy I have the biggest problem with. And it's not just because he owned 200 slaves. It's not just because he had runaways whipped And it's not just because he broke up black families, it's because he knew better. And we know he knew better because he said things like, when he was talking about slavery, he said things like, "I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just." But he didn't let that concern in any way alter his behavior, which in my book does make him something of a scoundrel. You think that's too harsh?
Yes. I mean, I certainly don't think of him as a scoundrel.
Okay.
Because, first of all, he totally supported the abolition of the slave trade in 1806. So it's not like he was... I think you're right that there's obviously a discordance there, but I think it was a discordance for anybody who took as seriously as he did the issues raised by slavery, who nevertheless was living in a slave-owning part of the country where there was an absolute determination on the part of many other people, not him, to maintain this system in perpetuity, and he had to somehow work his way around that, and these were, in many cases, his friends and neighbors. So you would have to ask, well, why doesn't he just sell his slaves and move to Philadelphia or New York and just get away from all that? It's because in the 18th century, people didn't do that. Choice wasn't conceived in those kinds of terms. And moreover, he would have stayed, presumably because he thought he would be a better plantation owner than other people would have been. So no, I don't see him as a scoundrel. I see him as caught in contradictions of his time.
You make him sound like a victim.
No, not as a victim, he did have choices to make. So he supported the abolition of the slave trade. He had what we consider unacceptable views about how slavery should be ended, that the blacks should be sent back to Africa, although that had a long history in the United States after him as well, about that as a particular solution. So no, I don't see him as a scoundrel. I don't see him as misguided. I see him as trying to come to terms with contradictory points of view, which included, he could say he believed that all men were born equal, but he clearly saw all kinds of hierarchy in the society he lived in, not just black-white, but in the social order amongst whites themselves.
You know, of all the things that have been said about the value of studying history, the most famous quote by far comes from George Santayana, who I don't think anyone actually reads anymore. No. He was this philosopher who is pretty obscure at this point. But he did say that those who cannot remember the past are doomed to repeat it. Are there, in fact, lessons to be learned from history? And if so, does that mean that historians have a legitimate role to play in solving contemporary problems?
You know, that's really not an easy question to answer, truth be told. I mean, yes, I think there are lessons to be learned from history. We think there are more lessons to be learned from history than is probably true. But what really is true is that we just can't get away from the weight of history on our minds, whether it's our own personal histories or our national or international history. So, for example, Hitler, Mussolini, World War II, these occupy they have an enormous impact on the way we think of the present, even now, many decades later, because it was so shocking. Similarly, one could say in the era of the late 18th, early 19th century, the French Revolution, the rise of Napoleon, just had a stunning impact on the way people imagined historical possibilities. And people were nervous about this for decades afterwards. So I think we think that we learn something from history, perhaps more than we actually do learn something from history, because we never do repeat the past exactly. Things are always a little different, and we're often wrong about the analogies to be drawn. I mean, this is one of the things that's constantly coming up. 1989, in Eastern Europe, for example, everyone was thinking revolution. Oh my God, this is going to mean, chaos, anarchy, hundreds of thousands of people killed, massive uprising. It'll be like the Russian Revolution in reverse. Not true.
Yeah. So all of that said, do historians belong in public policy think tanks? Does it make sense for them to serve as top advisors to the President of the United States? Do they have a legitimate role to play?
More than ever. This is what we have learned in a way that has been just sort of tragic, especially with the events in the Middle East, which is that the Iranian Revolution happens and no one has any idea about what is going on in that part of the world. The incredible tension between Sunnis and Shia, and no one in the United States even knows there's a difference between Sunni and Shia until this happens. It's crucial to have people who can explain what the history of Syria has been up to now in order to have a clue about what is going on now in that country.
You know, President John Kennedy did have a top advisor who was an historian. His name was Arthur Schlessinger Jr.
Yes.
And he had something rather interesting to say about all this. He said, quote, "The questions that policymakers put to history are most often the questions that history is least qualified to answer." You agree with that?
It's not, so, okay, I get the point of Schlesinger's remark, which is that you can't go to history and find the answer to your question, because your question's in the present, and the present is not the past. Absolutely true. What history does is give you perspective.
You know, there's something else that Schlesinger said that I want to bounce off of you, and this comes from an op-ed that he wrote for the New York Times in 1996, in which he criticized both liberals and conservatives, both, for using history for what he called national therapy. And let me read to you from the column a little bit. He wrote, "Militant monoculturalists of the right want history to instill and extol patriotism, religion, and the superior virtues of unregulated capitalism. Militant multiculturalists of the left want history to dump the big names of the past, those deplorable dead white European males, and build the self-esteem of minorities by telling them how wonderful and creative their own ancestors were." So when it comes to distorting the past, Schlesinger apparently believed that both liberals and conservatives are more or less equally culpable. Do you accept that?
I think that it is possible that all sort of agendas for history, in a way, have a built-in bias in them. I think that's absolutely true. But that's why what's exciting in a country like ours and in most of the West, where there's an enormous amount of room for debate about these subjects, is precisely that we can argue about. What's really disturbing is places where the government completely controls, for example, what's in the textbooks, and there's one line, and that's the line that is taken. That is really the problem. When there's a conflict between the right and the left, and the center, for that matter, because he was really talking about a three-way conflict in which he was representing the center between these two poles. With that kind of conflict, this is great, because it lets us talk about, well, what is history for? What should we be emphasizing? What are the virtues of this approach as opposed to that approach? I think that's terrific to have that kind of debate.
Yeah. Now, as it so happens, 2 years before Schlesinger wrote that column, the university that you're now affiliated with, UCLA, got embroiled in a red-hot controversy over how American history should be taught in our schools.
Yes.
Did you remember that controversy?
I was not there then, but
I
know some of the people who were involved in it.
Yeah.
This was you're talking about the national standards debate.
Yeah, this was when the National Center for History at UCLA came out with some standards and some model lesson plans, and it really all hit the fan when Lynn Cheney, who had chaired the National Endowment for Humanities, published a piece in the Wall Street Journal excoriating the historians at UCLA for presenting a distorted and overly grim picture of America's past. And she made that argument largely through statistics.
Yes.
Do you think there was any merit at all to the argument that she was making?
No.
You don't?
No. I mean, that is, I think that first of all, I think she exaggerated entirely, and I'm sure she didn't do any of the research that was involved in her claims either. But the point being that I think it's perfectly valid to have a debate, and so in that sense, I'm certainly not opposed to her writing the piece and raising the issue of how history should be taught. But this was very much a knee-jerk reaction against the sort of social history of the 60s and 70s of women, of slaves, of workers, of and eventually of Asian Americans and Latino Americans and all the different hyphenated American groups that we now have histories of. It was a knee-jerk reaction against that, and seeing it as a threat to the notion of a kind of a coherent national narrative, and to patriotism of the nation, for that matter. I think, actually, on all of that, she has been proved wrong. This has not led to a decline of patriotism in the United States. I don't think anybody any longer fears a decline of patriotism in the United States. One of the things that's really striking about this country is how even very recent immigrants can feel an attachment to the United States, which is not at all hurt by hearing the history, reading the history of their group or their country and its contribution to the United States narrative. It's extremely important to bring those people in to the narrative precisely so that they'll feel an allegiance to the country of which they are now a part. So that's the sense in which I say no categorically. I think she was completely wrong about the effect that this had.
So you don't think it is at all valid to argue that the sort of multiculturalism that left-of-center historians like to promote particularizes history, robs us of a common sense of humanity? I mean, there are some like Gertrude Himmelfarb, for example, who make that argument. Right. You just reject that.
I reject it in the sense that, I mean, I can see why people feared that at a certain moment, but I think it's quite clear now that, well, there are various different approaches, but certainly one possible approach is that the new narrative is the narrative of how a multicultural nation came to be. After all, we are made up of constantly different waves of immigration over time, and there were people here when those first immigrants arrived in the 17th century. There actually were people living here, which when I was a child, we were never taught about. Now, every child in every state of this country, I believe, finds out about the indigenous people who lived in their state. When I was a child, we never heard about them. I mean, we went and looked at Indian mounds because I lived in Minnesota, and there was a pretty big Indian presence, or what we called Indian presence, Native American presence. But that was never part of the history book. I think it's incredibly important that that's part of the history book because it's part of a big issue everywhere in the world today, which is what are nations based on resettlement? What is their identity like? How do they deal with their indigenous populations? And what does it mean to bring in constantly new waves of people? How does that change the narrative, and how does the narrative keep the same? This is an extremely important issue for actually all countries in the world now, that immigration has become a worldwide phenomenon and virtually inescapable, at least for the West.
Let's get back to the French Revolution.
Okay.
For the 2004 edition of the book that you published in 1984, you wrote a new preface in which you admitted that when you began your research, you had hoped to show that the Marxist interpretation of the French Revolution still held water, but that the facts and your analysis of those facts did not at all bear that out. Would I be entirely off base to suggest that for you and for so many other historians, the explanatory power of Marxist theory has turned out to be a terrible disappointment?
No, I don't think I would want to go that far. I think, in fact, certainly recent financial problems have actually led to a revival of Marxism with many qualifications along the way. The thing is that I think of Marx in much more historic terms than sort of present-day theoretical terms. Marx had an incredibly powerful analysis of the way the world worked, and he wrote it in the 1840s, 1850s, 1860s, essentially. Not surprisingly, there were things that he did not see coming. so it was a very powerful framework, and it got a lot of allegiance from intellectuals and other people at a certain moment in history that had to do with the rise of fascism and trying to find a counterweight to it, and a variety of other things that are probably too obvious or too detailed to go into right now. So it's not that I think that it's completely lacking in explanatory power. On the contrary, one of the big issues has been, well, if it's not going to be a Marxist interpretation, what's it going to be instead? So I think that's been one of the big issues in my field of the French Revolution, which was so dominated by Marxism for a certain period of time. Not forever, but for a certain period of time, let us say, between the 1920s and the 1970s. Marxism had a very big influence in interpretations of the French Revolution because the French Revolution was so important to Karl Marx himself. So he made many references to it in his work.
It seems that when you look at the fate of big history ideas, that they've all kind of led to a certain amount of disappointment and disenchantment and disillusionment.
Right.
I mean, there was the great man theory of the 19th century that boiled history down to the biographies of great men. There was Marxist theory that boiled history down essentially to class conflict.
Right.
There was the modernist theorists, the modernist theories that basically saw history as a contest between the forces of change and the forces of tradition. And then you had historians like Fernand Braudel, who stressed impersonal factors like geography and climate, and saw the conscious action of the conscious actions of human beings as mere froth on the surface of the ocean. All of these ideas had their heyday, generated excitement, but in the end, there seemed to be with each of them a sense of disillusionment, a sense of disappointment. Are there any big history ideas out there that are still worth holding on to, or in the final analysis, is history just one damn thing after another?
Well, it's certainly not just one damn thing after another. And I would say about the big ideas, one, there is a big idea out there, and that's what I tried to talk about in my book, which is the idea of globalization. That globalization is what explains much of what happens in history. I don't think that it can explain everything that happens in history, but I think it's a factor that we will now take into account. But similarly, I think about all the previous great theories that you cited, I see not so much the disappointment in them. Of course, there was criticism about what they could not explain in the end. But each of them has actually taught us to look for certain kinds of things in the past, and they are still very much part of the toolkit of historical research, and I don't think have gone away. I mean, Braudel is an obvious example where, yes, I think he de-emphasized politics and culture too much, and there was a move away from that. But we're back to being interested in geography and especially environment in ways that he was very prescient about, writing in the late 1940s in his great book on the Mediterranean. And we're much more interested in oceans, we're interested in the areas around oceans, and we're definitely interested in the general problem of topography and environment and how it shapes the history we live in. So in some ways that's come back. And Marxist elements have come back. The great man elements have come back. Even modernization elements, I would argue, have come back. So it's not that they just disappoint and disappear. It's that we criticize them, we see their limitations, and they remain part of the way that we think about history. They remain options for what we might think about. We're not always, what's new is not just something that we've never heard of before, but putting things together in new kinds of ways.
Professor Hunt, thank you so much for doing this program. I really
Mary,
appreciate it.
thank you so much for having me.